Steve, did it work?
No. Okay.
I
I knew
think
how to,
Once
Yeah.
you do the control and print screen, I think if you then go to like Word, you can paste it into a document. Oh,
Good evening, everybody. We will be joining you shortly with our class, about 5 minutes, 4 minutes, I think, from now. We'll start the class. Okay, hello? Karen, you're there? I don't hear you.
I'm here.
Good, good. You see this screen is good?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, we will start shortly. We'll start at 7:30, so about 2 minutes.
so where can you get a test for COVID? Anyone know?
You're on Facebook right now. Beacon Testing.
Where is
.com.
that? Where is it?
Framingham.
Really?
Okay, but a little trick. You have to create a profile, and then you just have to sit on it and say refresh, refresh, refresh until you get an appointment. You have to
Yeah.
be
Where is
very
their place?
patient.
Where is their location?
It's Project Beacon, if you just Google it in
Yeah, but
Framingham.
that's not my point. But where do you have to go?
It's on 135 behind St. Tarcissus something
Yeah.
church.
Behind what?
It's on 135 across from the train station
Okay.
behind St. Tarcissus church. I don't know how to say it,
Okay.
but you can't walk in.
Okay.
Yeah, start walking. Just gotta go Beacon Project, beacon.com. That's where you go.
What is it?
Beacon, B-E-A-C-O-N, beacontesting.com.
Okay, great. I can
We're
probably
gonna
go
be
on
starting
after the class and just sign up for tomorrow sometime, right?
That's it. Yeah. We're gonna be starting in 1 minute.
Okay.
I think everybody know. Sharon. Joey.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi, Joe.
Sharon, you might want to take your input volume down if you know how to
Yeah.
do that.
Yeah.
That happens sometimes. Sorry about that. Thank you.
Okay, everybody, we're going to start this class. Welcome. And we're beginning a new book of Shemos, the second book of the Torah. And we have, and this parsha, this Torah portion, the beginning of this portion is, of course, about the Jewish people, the beginnings of them going into exile. Hence the world famous joke about living in denial. The Jewish people living in denial. Yes, is there a question there? Pardon? Okay, you guys can hear me? Okay, very good. So, and what we're going to study about today is the perils of over-reliance and what on self and what to think instead. The perils of over-reliance on self and what to think instead. So let's begin with an interesting question that we can challenge ourselves with. But let me start with an intro to that question, and that's about Western culture. Western culture, capitalist culture, hyper-capitalist environments that exist could be great. There's arguments for it, arguments against it. That's not what we're going to talk about. But the reality is that the environments that we live in, these capitalist Western culture environments we live in, mostly drive home the idea that success is all in our hands. And if you want to have a lot of material abundance, if you just got to have hard work and dreams and rugged individualism, and you're going to make it. And that's the way we're our systems are built. That's society around us. That's the thing that we hear a lot of times. Now, there's no question that there may be merit to, there is merit into a certain extent, realizing those ideas about hard work and getting there and having the dream, getting out of poverty. But sometimes, in a certain way, if we feel like that in the wrong way, as we're going to discuss here today, as we're going to explain here today, there are great spiritual pitfalls that can take place if we have too much over-reliance and a misplaced belief in ourselves, and it could be very different than having God-centered environment. I mean, the Torah is about having faith in God. Of course, we have God believes in us. So we want to look at this. These are eternal messages that come out in the Torah. So here's the question. I wanted to challenge ourselves with a question. We can ask ourselves the question. We don't have to say it out loud unless we want to. And Steve Jobs of Apple, of blessed, right? Steve Jobs earned the admiration of millions and millions of people all over the world. And he became almost idolized. He had tremendous vision, and he's a self-made success, and he inspired many, many people. So now here is the question that I wanted to pose for ourselves, that we shall ask ourselves. If you were giving a child a pep talk on the topic of how to make it in life, would you use Steve Jobs as an example? Your own child sitting in front of you, they're 8 or 10 years old. Would you put a picture or show the screen of Steve Jobs and say, that's a self-made man? I think you should be like that. Any responses? Just curious.
Sure.
Yes.
I don't know enough about Steve Jobs, the man, to use him as a role model. I know enough about him where I'm very curious and I would do the research, but the most important thing that I would say to my daughter is to always be true to yourself and go over the values that we have as a family and in our faith. And I try to be a role model for her in doing that. So before I would use anyone as a role model, I would want to know a little backstory first to see if that's the right type of person.
Right. So good. So you're a thinking person. You want to make sure things are done right. But the reason that example I'm bringing up is I mentioned that we have to be careful of the spiritual pitfalls of over-reliance and what that means. Because we should rely on ourselves. We got to believe you. So what does that mean? And where do we get this? Let's go into this week's Torah portion and let's see where this comes from, where this whole thing actually comes from. So our portion begins, so here it is, would you use him for an example? So our portion begins the story of the Jewish people going into slavery in Egypt. And the Jewish people have been thriving there in Egypt to the extent that they've had miraculous births, as the Torah tells us. The birth rate of the Jewish people was going very, very much. And in only 210 years, there were now a couple million Jewish people. And Egypt at the time was afraid. There's a fifth column arising. They're going to either throw us out, or they'll fight with us, or there'll be a problem. So a dictator at the time named Pharaoh decided on a decree, as we all know, because we read the story and heard the story. What decree did he decide upon? This is 80 years before Moshe is even born. The decree was, Kol haben, text 1:8, Kol haben hayila da'ira tashlichu. Pharaoh commanded all his people, saying, every son, every male who is born to the Jewish people, you shall cast into the Nile, and every daughter you shall allow to live. Okay, so they started to toss the boys, a terrible, harsh decree, into the river. Into which river? Into the Nile River. So at that time, as the Torah tells us in the beginning of this week's Torah portion, Moses' mother, her name was Yocheved. Yocheved gave birth to a baby boy who would grow up to be Moshe, as we see in the Parsha. And the Parsha tells us that he recognized, first of all, Amram, his father, was the leader of the Jewish people at the time. Many people aren't aware. That's why I'm sharing that. Amram was the leader of the Jewish people at the time. And when he was born, there was Rashi writes, Ki toivhu, the baby was good. Every baby is good when they're born. But there was a certain light that emanated. So she understood that this is somebody special over here, a special baby boy, not just everybody being special. So we know there was a decree at the time to throw the baby boys into the river. And the police, the state police, would of course come by and check the houses and make sure. Now, he was born to 6 months and a day. So she had some time because however they measured and would check, she knew she had a couple of months to hide him until they would come by and throw Moses into the river as well. So what did she do? Now 3 months, she hid him for 3 months. Now 3 months comes by. She knows she has to hide him in some way. So what does the Torah tell us that she does? She went, as we know the story, but let's go through because the details are going to be important there. When she could no longer, the Torah itself says, she could no longer hide him, she took for him a reed basket, smeared it with clay and pitch, the water shouldn't get in, placed the child into it, and put it into the marsh at the bank of the river. Svasayir, the Nile's edge. The marsh at the bank of the river. Okay. Now, why did she do this? So far, that's what the Torah says itself. But we are going to discuss a number of midrashic commentary sources that explain to us the background, what was going on. As we know very often, the Torah will tell us a story, and this background, the oral Torah, gives us from the time of Moses was told us. So what happened? What does the Medrash ask? So the Medrash says, Pharaoh had a lot of ways to issue a decree against the Jewish people. Why did he pick throwing the babies into the Nile River? We read in the Torah that Pharaoh had Chachamim, his advisors. More importantly, who he listened to very carefully was the Mechashvim and the astrologers. And they relied heavily. They relied very much on astrology. And as the Medrash explains, that in those times, the forces of impurity had something that they could sense. They had no clarity, but by being stargazers, they had some kind of that they could see something into the future, but were unclear what they could see. What did they see? The Medrash tells us. What did they see? They saw that a leader was going to be born to the Jewish people, and the leader that's going to be born to the Jewish people would redeem the Jewish people from Egypt. Pharaoh, and they said, Mr. Pharaoh, Sir Pharaoh, we got to do something because there's one Jewish boy. We don't know where he is. We don't know what family he's from. He's going to be born. And the Medrash continues that they also saw that he would one day be harmed by water. And as we know the story in the future, how was Moshe harmed by water? And years later, towards the end of his life, when he hit the rock instead of speaking to the rock, and God said, "You're not going to go into the land of Israel." So they saw these things that were unclear what they're seeing. So they told Paro, number one, there's a Jewish baby boy going to be born to take out the Jews. And number two, he's going to be harmed by water. So the assumption was that what they better do is, if they drown, because they were terrified of the Jewish people in general. So if every Jewish boy being born was drowned in the water, one of them is going to be that Jewish boy, and therefore he will never be able to carry. He's harmed by water, so we'll harm him by water in this way. That's what the Medrash says, the very common Medrash that's always brought to people to understand it. So let's look at the Medrash, the Talmud brings it too. Let's look at right over there, the Talmud brings the same thing. So that says what? They saw, Talmud Sota tractate, they saw in their 12b, they saw in their astrology that the savior of the Jewish people would be stricken by water. They arose and decreed, every son that is born, you shall cast him into the river. So this is common knowledge, the reason for it, why they were doing it. So now what happens? Yocheved, Moshe's mother, decided that she wants to avert this decree. It's very difficult to hide him. So she figures, I'm going to put him into the Nile River. Since it's unclear, they don't know with clarity what they're seeing. Once he's in the water, the astrologers will then see, he's already in the water, and they'll abolish the decree. They'll say that the Redeemer of the Jewish people has already been harmed by water. That was her reasoning. So they would see the signs that he's already in the Nile, and they would stop their pursuit, and they would abolish the decree, and her son would be saved as well. And that's what the Medrash Shemot says in the next Medrash. If you look over here, why did she cast him into the river? Medrash Shemot Rabbah says she saw so that the astrologers would think that he had already been cast into the river and would no longer look for him. It's over. The decree is over. Her plan actually succeeded. That day, the astrologers saw in their vision, this is all background to what we're going to talk about. The astrologers saw in their vision that the leader had already been cast into the water, assuming the decree had served this purpose. So the Talmud says, Moshe and the rest of the newborn Jewish boys were then saved. And here's where the Talmud goes back to the Talmud we said before. Once Yocheved cast Moses into the water, the astrologers said, we no longer see anything like that sign, that they canceled the decree. So from that time on, the decree was canceled. Great. That's the background. So it's an interesting, when you look at these stories, and you look at the words of the Torah, sometimes you pick up on a nuance and you start wondering about that nuance, and sometimes that little nuance reveals something else. So here's a question that the Rebbe quotes from the Ragachover. The Ragachover was a tremendous genius and he had an unbelievable mind. Anyway, so he asked a simple question. If we go back to text 1b, what we said before, where did Yocheved put Moshe's basket? Where did she put his basket? So we said, go back for a second, here it is. She put it at the end in the marsh at the Nile's edge. Now, actually, it couldn't even mean bank of the river. Not in the river itself, in the marsh at the edge of the river. That's where she put the basket. Now, do we remember here what happened to the basket afterwards? Remember that Moshe's sister Miriam was watching very carefully to see what happens to the baby. And the daughter of Paro at that point, she came to wash herself, to bathe in the Nile River, right? Then she says, oh, this is baby boy then, right? And what does the Torah say then? She stretches out her hand She sees he's in crying. She has rachmanis on him. She has compassion on him. She pulls him out of the water, and she says, "Oh, this is a Jewish baby boy. It must be a Jewish baby boy." And she ends up saving the baby boy. Now, she named him. The Torah says, "We're going to show it to you right here in a moment." She named him Moshe. Why did she name him Moshe? Let's look at why she named him Moshe. Okay. Oops. A little further. Okay. 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 Here it is. The child grew up. She took the baby out. She took him to the house, to her palace. She brought him to Pharaoh's daughter. Miriam brought him back. He became like her son, like Bathia's son, like the daughter of Pharaoh's son. She named him Moses, and she said, what did she say? Why did she call him Moshe? The Hebrew word means, I drew him from the water. So the Rakachover asked the question, I thought he was in the marsh at the edge of the river. How did he get into what happened? Why is it say she drew him from the water? All she did was hide him in the marsh at the bank of the river. It's just a little nuance. And later the Torah says, no, she drew him from the water. That's his whole name, Moshe. That's where it comes from. So what happened? Did she put him in the river, or did she put him next to the river? That's the big question. In the river or next to the river? So listen to this. This is where it gets very interesting. Before we determined whether the basket with Moshe was next to the river or in the river, let's understand what the river was about. There's a great significance in Egypt to the Nile River. What's the significance of the Nile River? Look, first of all, we find the Nile River very often. Throughout the story of the Jews in Egypt, the Nile is very all the time. Paro, way back, has a dream about cows. 7 fat cows and 7 lean cows. Where are the cows standing? On the Nile River. That's what it says. He then issues a decree later, of course, a different power. He issues a decree to harm the Jewish people. Where should you throw them? In the Nile. Later on in the Torah, Moshe comes to warn Paro about the plagues, and he finds Paro where? Bathing in the Nile, the Torah says. The Nile's coming up all the time. The first plague to hit Egypt, the Nile turns to blood. The second one is frogs from the Nile. A lot about the Nile then. So Rashi explains to us it was not just a river in Egypt. The Nile River was an integral part of the culture of Egypt. Why was it an integral part of the culture of Egypt? It was their water source. It doesn't rain in Egypt. And the Egyptians relied on they irrigated, the Nile rises. They dug trenches throughout Egypt, and the Nile rises and irrigates the crops. And it's the key to the economy and the sustenance of Egypt. So much so that that's where their sustenance came from. The Rashi says they deified the Nile. They made it a god. The Nile was a god in Egypt. And Rashi says that right here. There is no rainfall in Egypt. And the Nile rises and waters the land. So the Egyptians worship the Nile. So this explains actually why Pharaoh's dreams take him to the Nile, why he uses the Nile to demonstrate his dominance over the Jews, right? He's throwing the boys into the Nile River, their god. This explains why the first plague, God targets the Nile. Of all the plagues, the first one hits the god of Egypt. Why? Because their sustenance came from there, their water came from there, all the crops grew as a result of this Nile. Now, that also explains, says the Rakachover. Now, the way that Rakachover looked at Torah, by the way, he always found halacha within Torah as well. So what he says was, this explains, and it wasn't just halacha, it's a way of thinking, why Moshe's mother did not place the basket in the river. She placed the basket at the side of the river. Why? She's not going to put the basket in an idolatry, we'll put it in the marsh that's on the side. But why? Because according to Jewish law, actually, the law is if something is an idol, a Jew is not allowed to use it, not just worship it. It's like chametz on Pesach, believe it or not. You're not allowed to have benefit. You're not allowed to have any benefit from something that's an actual idol. So, for example, if some foods are offered to an idol, actually, or spices are part of a certain idolatrous service, or there's a tree that people are worshiping, you're not allowed to have shade under that tree. And you can't use the spices, and you can't use the food. It's one of the 3 cardinal sins in Judaism that you're not allowed to use even to save a life. And let's look at that law. It's just an interesting law, how far Jewish law tells us about not using the Nile, not using idolatry. Look at this. Maimonides says, when a person becomes sick and is in danger of dying, if the physicians say that his cure involves transgressing a given Torah prohibition, the physician's advice should be followed. For example, if it's a non-kosher food, your life is in danger, you're supposed to have the non-kosher food because life is more important. It overrides, saving the life overrides all the transgressions, except whenever there is a danger to life, one may use any of the Torah's prohibitions as a remedy, with the exception of the worship of false gods, forbidden sexual relations, and murder. Even when there's a danger to life, one may not use them as a remedy. So this is Moshe's mother, Yocheved. And she has to save the baby. But you can't use the Nile River. But she wants to nullify the decree. She's got to nullify the decree. So she puts him at the edge of the river. Now what happens? Okay. So she's trying to fool the astrologers. She wants to give off the impression that he's in the water. So what happens then? Very interesting next thing that happens. Comes Pharaoh's daughter. Her name was Basya, by the way. Pharaoh's daughter comes. And she comes to bathe in the river. Now, we certainly know she was a righteous woman because she saved Moshe, who was a Jewish boy. But she was actually more than that. And actually, that's why her name is Batya. Batya means daughter of the Yud and the Hey, which is God's name. Batya, the daughter of, because a ger, somebody who converts ultimately, or somebody who denounces idolatry, she becomes connected directly to Hashem. Anyway, why did she come to bathe in the river at that time? The Medrash tells us at that moment in time, she was fed up with that. She realized that idolatry of her father's household, of the entire Egypt, was false. And what she wanted to do, as the Gemara says here, Talmud says, the verse says, and the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe in the river. Rabbi Yochanan said in the name of Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, this teaches that she came down to the river to cleanse herself from the impurity of her father's idols. And the halacha is, supposing a non-Jew worships a particular idol, that idol, as we mentioned, becomes in a new category. It becomes in the category of you can't use it for anything. But what if the non-Jew denounces it? They come to the realization that an idol is a false thing, and they denounce it. So she came to the realization that the Nile River, the whole idolatry was a false thing. And she came to denounce it by washing herself off from the impurity of her father's idols. So by bathing in that river, daughter of Pharaoh, the princess of Egypt, is knocking off and denouncing the whole Nile River. Now all of a sudden, the moment that she did that for sure, the Nile is no longer a god because she went to wash herself off from that. The moment the Nile River is no longer a god, now you're allowed to use the river to save yourself. So the basket, which was now on the edge of the river, now moved into the river itself because the river could now be used to save Moshe as well. So she was doing teshuvah, actually. Has anybody ever heard this idea that she went to bathe herself from the idolatry? You heard that? Anyway, that's what the Gemara says. So the laws of so what happened right now? Now it went into the middle of the river, and Basya sees the basket in the middle. She takes the basket. So two major things happen simultaneously. One is the Nile River is no longer a god. She denounced it. She purged it of its idolatrous status. Number two, what happened was now the decree stopped because the astrologers say, "Hey, the Jewish leader was already thrown in. He's in the water already." They went back to power and they nullified the decree. So two things happened simultaneously. The idolatry of Egypt was nullified through the daughter of power, one. And two, the decree was stopped and nullified at the same time. Very, very, very interesting. That's how the Rakachava understands that little nuance that we said. Edge of the river, middle of the river. So the Rebbe wants to ask a question on this, the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And he says that's a beautiful piece from the Rakachava. But what is the underlying theme shared by both events? How do they both connect? And they're two important events, but there's some kind of the connect. We want to develop that connection between these two things: nullification of a deity of Egypt, Jewish boys being saved, and Moshe being the agent to make that happen. Right after he's born. Let's develop that, and that's what the Rebbe wants to develop and make it clear for us. It's not just a random connection. It was a good thing to do at the time. Two things happened nicely. So let's talk a little bit more about the Egyptians worshiping the Nile, what that meant as being a deity. We explained there was no rain in Egypt. But there's a little bit more than that. It's very interesting. We find later in the Torah, Moshe, as he's getting the Jewish people, later in his life, of course, when at the end of the 40 years, he's getting the Jewish people ready to go to the land of Israel. He tells them all types of different things. One of the things that he tells them, very interesting statement. He says, the land of Israel is not like the land of Egypt. The physical land of Israel is not like the physical land of Egypt. What's the difference? The land of Egypt, if you want to irrigate your crops, you have to use the Nile, and you have to schlep water. In the land of Israel, it rains. That's how we get our rainwater. That's how we get our crops to grow. In Egypt, there's a whole system. There's irrigation ditches all over. There's water carrying canals. And if your field is uphill, let's say it's a little bit higher up, you got to work higher. And Rashi explains a little bit more this thing that Moshe was warning and telling the Jewish people. We'll soon see what the warning was about. But let's look here for a second. And this we just to back up, Bati purified herself from renounced idolatry. Okay, the decree from Moshe in the river could be now nullified. Okay. Let's look. Okay. We ask the question. Here's Rashi. Here's Rashi explaining the difference a little bit more. And this is where we're going to get to a little bit more about how Egypt, the nature of Egypt developed self-reliance. Here's where we go. Let's see how it goes. Rashi says, when Moshe is saying this, the land of Egypt required bringing water from the Nile by foot to water. You had to rise from your sleep and toil. You had to work hard. Only the low-lying areas were naturally watered by the Nile, but not the highland. So you had to carry up water from the lower to the higher areas. That's Egypt. But the Holy Land, as the Torah says, quote, absorbs water from the rains of heavens, unquote. while you sleep in your bed, the Holy One, blessed be is He, waters both low and high areas, both areas that are exposed, both areas that are exposed and those that are not exposed, all at once. So when you compare these two lands, one advantage is, okay, you don't have to get up early, right? And you don't have to schlep up all the way to the high hills. That the work of the water is easier. But on the flip side, the Nile is more reliable. The Nile is a sure thing. The water is always there. And even though it takes a lot of work to get the water to the highland, but it's in your control. You have the ability to make those crops grow. You just got to work harder, and you can make it happen. Rainwater is very different. We don't have an influence whether it rains or not. It's not up to us. I got to rely on God in Israel in order to make sure that the place gets water. Is that I can't look at myself. So unlike Egypt, where the whole crop cycle is in your control, the Jewish people had to pray for it to rain, to be in the Holy Land, to rain there. And Moshe said to them, I want you to recognize that it's not going to happen automatically when you get to Israel. It's not like Egypt where your crops are going to always grow because you're always ready to do it and it's in your control. It's not going to happen automatically. The way it's going to happen is you have to change internally. You're going to have to rely or learn to rely on God above and pray to God. And the way you're going to do this is by observing God's will. That's what he told them. By doing the mitzvahs and doing what God wants and being the right type of a person, those spiritual efforts will make the physical rain come down. Very different. The Ramban, another commentary, similar around after Rashi, explains this a little bit more. Look at the Ramban. Here's the Nachmanides. Moshe told the people, remember, we're getting to the point about self-reliance, and we're getting to the point, we want to get to the point about where the connection between the Nile and the abolishing of the decree. So here we are saying it's going to depend on your spiritual stuff. Here, now let's go to Nachmanides, 7b. Moshe told the people, know that this land is not like the land of Egypt, which must be watered by foot from the rivers and lakes like a vegetable garden. Rather, it's a land of mountains and valleys, watered by rain alone. God must constantly send rain, for it is a very parched land, relying on rain all year long. Should you transgress God's will, causing God to withhold his blessing for rain, you will be left with an extremely difficult land that cannot be sown and will not sprout, and no grass will grow on its mountain. We say it in the Shema all the time. If you listen to Hashem's will, the commandment that I'm giving you, then we say later, then there'll be rain at the right time. So the nature of the land will bring up an environment of you got to get yourself together, spiritual. Okay. And this, the Rebbe connects to the points that we're saying. Let's look at the next. So, if you're in Egypt, okay, you assume, by the way, I'm going to read what the Rebbe says in a second, you assume that nature is in charge of everything. Survival of the fittest is a natural, if you're stronger and you're going to work hard, you'll make it. There's no God. Nature. And the Nile is the God. So the very core of being in Egyptian culture was materialism, working hard, self-reliance, and that leads to pleasure, hedonism, materialism. It's a natural outgrowth of that. It's a lifestyle, which is Egyptian self-reliance. So they really worship the Nile. Let's look at what the Rebbe says on this. So the Rebbe brings this. When a person knows that they must rely upon rain from heaven, then even when they experience abundance, things are growing, it's still somewhat less likely that their heart will grow haughty and forget the Lord their God, as the Pasuk says. Because even when you have, hey, like we said last week about the the Ferris wheel, when you're on the top, it's going down. You don't know. But the person knows that as much as they can tend to the matters within their control, you can plow, you can plant, they still have to rely on God. But when a person is in Egypt, which God created in such a way that the Nile rises and waters and fields naturally, one doesn't see any reason to rely upon him. Therefore, one convinces themselves, as the Torah uses that term, my strength and the might of my hand has accumulated all this wealth for me, forgetting, God forbid, that it is God who gives you strength to make wealth. So this deepens our understanding of this decree to cast the Jewish babies into the water, into the Nile River. So besides it just being a terrible genocidal decree, that we got to throw these, he found a way to kill them, it was very symbolic. It was an Egyptian attempt to drown the Jewish people in an Egyptian mindset that there is no God and everything's under human control, and the Nile is the God, and nature is the God, and nothing else controls anything. And the Jewish people should be drowned in that mind. So it was very symbolic and reflected a spiritual immersion into Egypt to get rid of the Jewish people, as in that sense as well. Paro's ultimate goal, the Rebbe says, was to cast them into the river that is in the Nile, which was their idol. In other words, Paro wanted the Jewish people to be cast and drowned in the idolatry of Egypt. So that's actually, very interestingly, the whole idea of the Egyptian slavery in Egypt. Egyptian slavery, besides being physical bondage, it was also a spiritual effort. And to bring them to an Egyptian mindset that there's no such thing as God. It was not only physical. So based on this whole thing, we actually can now understand the small detail, another detail, about when the real Egyptian physical slavery started as well. At what point in time? They were there for 210 years, and the beginning of when they were there was great. Joseph was the viceroy. Remember that time? And they were prosperous, and Joseph was the leader, and it happened over time. But what was the main point when things went and became bad? So the main point, it says, the main point was when it says like this: Joseph died, okay, as well as all his brothers and all of that generation. Right after the 12 brothers who had come from the land of Israel, who had been the sons of Yaakov, right after they died, it says the children of Israel were fruitful and swarmed and increased and became very strong. And then it says a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. So technically, that was the historical progression. And when Joseph was alive, it's natural that the family wouldn't be enslaved at that time. We understand that. But we also understand that the Torah makes a point and says, after Joseph died and all the brothers died, the brothers themselves could never have fallen into the Egyptian mentality and the Egyptian way of thinking of that full self-reliance. They could never have succumbed that there's no such thing as a divine power. Well, it says after they died, that's when it happened. They themselves lived in Israel before they came to Egypt. They had seen the divine reality for themselves. They experienced reliance on God. That's where they came from. And they grew up that way under Yaakov's influence. So that's something they could never forget. So as long as Joseph and his brothers were alive, not just because Joseph was viceroy, even after he passed away, but the brothers were alive, the Egyptian idea of self-reliance, egoism, worshiping the Nile couldn't have sway over the Jewish people. Only after they passed away and the younger generation started to come up, now there was a danger of submerging the Jewish people into the Nile of the god of the self-reliance of Egypt. They could fall into it. The brothers couldn't fall into it. And that's the point that Rebbe makes here. He says like this: as long as Yaakov and his sons were still alive, Pharaoh's decree to cast the boys into the river spiritually, not just physically, was not possible. Because the river, remember, there's a distinction. Israel and Egypt is based on the Nile. So when they had lived in the land of Israel, they had seen openly that everything depended on God. Therefore, even when they arrived in a place where you could only see the natural order, that didn't cause them to forget it, didn't obscure their prior vision of godliness. They had the idea of God and belief in God and understanding that God is, but when they're in that environment, it didn't change them. But their descendants was harder. Only after Yosef died, as well as his brothers and all that generation, when nobody remained from those who had lived in the land of Israel, could the decree to cast them into the river take place physically and take effect physically and spiritually as well. All right, so that's what happened. Time passed, and the memory of the divine reality was forgotten. It says the Jewish people always had some kind of a faith, but it wasn't a deep faith. And what kind of faith did they have? So that I mentioned this idea before, it's very interesting. The Talmud gives an example of this of real faith, and the faith is there. It's there, but not so. And it's the story of you've heard me say that, for some of us, some of you have heard me say this probably, that when someone, a Jewish guy is a person is breaking into a house to rob and steal the house. And as he's climbing through the window, he prays to God that he shouldn't be caught. Please, God, save me and make sure I don't get caught. I should be able to steal. So the question is, if you believe in God, you're praying to God. God told you not to steal. What are you stealing for? And if you don't believe in God, what are you praying for? And the answer is this: we all have faith. We have it within us. It's part of our DNA, except it's hovering around us. It needs to be realized. And we have to know that we have it, and we have to feel it and be conscious and develop it so that it should be part of the way we live, not just something that's in the background. So the Jewish people had the faith, but they didn't have it in an internal way. And Pharaoh was committed to drowning the awareness of a divine reality, that they should run their lives according to that divine reality. So they were drowning. So who was going to save them? Who was going to stem the tide of this unholy attack? When we say we stem the tide of the unholy attack, I'm talking about the spiritual idea behind it too, the drowning in the ideas of the way Egypt thinks. Who would save them from that way of thinking, and also who would save them physically? Of course, that was Moshe. What did Moshe have that could change them, that could develop their faith and bring out the hidden faith that they have, bring out the sort of faith that was hovering around them, and make it real and conscious and meaningful and purposeful and part of their lives? So Moshe was sent. He's born, and the house is filled with light. The Shekhinah, the divine presence, is with him. He's a real tzaddik. And he has the ability to develop and nurture the faith. But when he is already even born, he does this as well. So two things happen when Moshe is born. Number one, because he is born and he represents the one who's going to bring out their faith. So what happens? The Nile, the decree of submerging the Jewish people in the Nile stops. Because the spiritual part is going to be gone now. Moshe arrives and is going to take away that spiritual angle of losing the faith in it. Secondly, which is of course related, he gets rid of, because he's there. Remember we said before, the day he's there, so the Nile is no longer an idolater, an idol. As soon as he arrives, and Basia comes at that moment, she, on the same day, the same moment that the basket is there, she washes herself off from the idolatry of Egypt. And now it's no longer an idol, at least for Basia, at least because Moshe is there. It's the beginning of turning around everything. It's no longer looking at the Nile as this is it. Nature is here and we're stuck as slaves here. Nothing else runs the world. So what is a tzaddik like Moshe? One of the names that Moshe and every leader of the Jewish people, a tzaddik, a real tzaddik, a rebbe, if you may, they're called by the Zohar as a Raya Mehemna, in Hebrew, Roa Neman, which means a faithful shepherd. You know, Moshe was a shepherd. Moshe cared about the individual sheep and the individual person. One of the ways it says that Moshe was tested, we'll go to that. We're going to see how he cared about each one. He was a faithful shepherd. But there's another meaning to faithful shepherd in Hebrew. It doesn't only mean faithful shepherd. He was dedicated, as we'll see in a second. But he also, the word faithful means he nurtured faith. That's what he did. What did Moshe do to the Jewish people? The most important thing that Moshe did was bring out that every Jew has faith. Now the Jewish people saw, as time went on, that Moshe was able to show them there's a God in the world. Nature is not it. You know, it's the self-reliance. There's a big picture here. And Moshe brought that out within each Jew. But let's first see how he was a faithful shepherd, and then how he was a shepherd who nurtures faith. The word can mean both. In Hebrew, Roa Neman means both a faithful shepherd, and Raya Mehemna means a shepherd who nurtures faith. Let's first see how he was dedicated to each and every individual Jew. Let's look at this. Okay? Here's the medrash. God chose to test Moshe with sheep. Remember, he was a shepherd before he came. This is before he came back, of course, to Egypt, when he was in Midian. The sages said, when Moses, our teacher, peace be upon him, was shepherding Jethro's flock in the desert, so one young goat ran off. Moshe ran after it until it reached a shelter and found it full of water. The goat stopped to drink. When Moshe caught up with it, he said, I didn't know that you ran away because you were thirsty. You must be tired. He lifted the goat upon his shoulders and went on his way. So that's what it says, how God tested Moshe. Oh, now you know how to take care of the sheep, you'll take care of my sheep, basically. God said, you're merciful in tending to a flock belonging to flesh and blood. Surely then you will shepherd my flock, which are the Jewish people. He had exceptional empathy, exceptional patience. He was sensitive to all creatures. And just like he did that for his own, for the sheep, he took care of the flock, he was able to look at a person and see what that person really needed. So he was a faithful shepherd. But then he was also, as I mentioned, a shepherd of faith. According to Kabbalah, that was his main job. And he nurtured faith in God. And he showed each Jew how God relates to them and how they can relate to God and how they already have their emunah. So I want to show this is not just a nice shot, a nice thing. So sometimes faith can seem abstract. And it's the goal of the faithful shepherd, the leader of the Jewish people, to bring about that faith. Here's what the Alter Rebbe writes about this shepherd of faith. It is written, dwell in the land and be nourished by faith. The word be nourished means to sustain, for it is necessary to sustain and feed the faith until it is fixed in a person's heart as well with real awareness, as if one sees it. So faith has to be nourished. And who does that? The man of faith, the shepherd. Moshe does that. So the Jewish people were enslaved in Egypt. And what were they doing in Egypt? They were building towers. What kind of towers? Egyptian towers. And they were caught up in the godlessness of Egypt. So Moshe had to free them mentally, have their mindset. And so once he began to do that, that's taking away the Nile from being the God and nature from being the God, and making God the real God the God. So the river was purged as soon as he's born from that faithlessness, and the decree was abolished as soon as he's born. So this is that Rebbe says these two events, the purging of the Nile of its idolatrous status and abolishing the decree of every son who is born, so the cast the Nile, is really the same thing, spiritually speaking. The decree, and this is the main point, and we'll get back to our original question. The decree that the boys must be cast into the river is associated with the fact that the river was an Egyptian deity. When Moses, the faithful shepherd, was born among the Jewish people in Egyptian exile and was subsequently placed into a space that most represented the exile and slavery, the river, Moshe was there. He made it possible to fight the idolatry. He made it possible. Now you can fight it. Automatically, the decree was abolished. By just being there, by that neshama, by that soul being there spiritually, he made it possible to fight that whole idolatry. That's what a tzaddik was. That's Hashem sent Moshe. It was a special neshama. So now, Egypt we left a long time ago, thousands of years ago. But the story of redemption we read every year. And every year we say to ourselves, we have to look at ourselves as if we were in Egypt and we left Egypt. So today, what it especially means is leaving the Egyptian mentality. And the Jewish people are actually natural believers. We are believers in God. We know that everything comes from God. We have a real connection with God. Life, though, happens. And we live in a culture that's very, very driven to be successful. And there's a belief that through our hard work, and if we surround ourselves by self-made people, it's easy to start worshiping them. And Steve Jobs, self-made billionaire, and his image is, if you wish so, you have to work hard and you can be self-reliant and you don't need anything else in the world. It's all in your control and only you can make it happen. That's the Nile. So the Jewish people started off originally in Israel, and they had an awareness, they had a keen faith, they had a belief in God. Then they moved to Egypt, and we got lost in the ideas. So now we do the same thing, really. We wake up in the morning. This is the good news. We can maintain that faith because we're out of Egypt already. We wake up in the morning and we say, thank you, God, for giving me back my soul. Thank you, God. There's God. He gave me back a soul. And then we say the brachas. And then we pray to God. We study a little Torah. When we do that, before we get out into the street, the faith is alive. Faith, I speak to God. I make a bracha. I wash my toes. But then we go into some other place of employment, place on the internet, and we face a world that has its own rules. And you have to be savvy, and you can only succeed if you're savvy, and if you only succeed if you follow the rules the way the world tells you the rules. If you make a mistake, you lose. So now the God idea is relegated to the back of the mind. But as the Rebbe explains to us, you don't have to get caught in that falsehood. And Moshe is there to save us. What does that mean? Who is Moshe? So the Gemara says, very interesting thing. Moshe was a faithful shepherd. and who nurtures faith. And we speak about spiritual things, and neshama. We all have a soul, right? But then there's a thing called a neshama klali, a general soul. A leader of the Jewish people, the head of the Jewish people, just like a head runs the body, includes all the souls are related to him inherently. And so we have within us a Moshe within us, basically. That's what I'm trying to say. And that Moshe within us, we already have that. We just gotta sharpen it. And remember, the blessing comes from God. Ultimately, we are serving God. And therefore, when we get into the world, we can take the davening we just did, the modani, the tefillin, the brachas, the this, the that, and live with a Jewish mentality where we're going. This is what the Rebbe said. Look at the Rebbe's words. One need not fear to plunge into the daily grind of mundane life. True, it's a downgrade from the spiritual awareness experienced earlier in the day. You're not davening at the time because one no longer sees godliness during work because he's focusing on work. Nevertheless, by awakening the spark of Moses in the soul, that's the faith in God is revealed, and one is nourished by faith. This takes him out of exile. When you remember in the middle of work, don't get so scared. There's a God that runs the world. Not everything is exactly because of the environment that I'm in is telling me what to do and how to live. They don't run the world, and my values and choices are based on God. So it's whatever the choices are. Shabbos, that's God told me, so I'm going to do it. But the environment, if you got to work hard, you got to work 7 days. It's an example. I don't really mean that. There's so many subtle things. So we don't worship the Nile. And so a Jew has the ability to rise up above this. And you don't have to go out and shop for faith and bring in something you don't have. We already have it within ourselves that is there. We have to look at, God told us to look at nature, to use nature. The blessing, God's blessing is in nature. I mean, you don't sit around and wait for your work, you might come in, get a job, but you do it with faith in God, not because faith in the work. He told me that I should work within the world. He wants me to take nature and sanctify nature. But I'm not going to get lost in it. And that's the idea of the faithful shepherd. So now let's look at the answer to this question. I wonder if that's actually denial. Why did the annulment of the decree and the change of the river's idolater status occur simultaneously? That was the Rebbe's question. Why did it come? And it has to do with Moshe's spark of faith. The Nile's power was exposed as false, resulting in the abolishment of slavery, being entrenched in Egyptian idolatry. So, misplacing priorities and forgetting where the blessing comes from is like worshiping the Nile. Ultimately, we are already capable of living a life of faith. That's the message we get from this Torah portion. And thank you for joining. Thank everybody for joining. If anybody has any comment, please feel free. Take a moment or two. Oh, by the way, I want to say that this class is dedicated dedicated in honor of the good health of Refuah Shlema for Yaakov Tzvi ben Tziv Yechaya. We should have you be in good health and Refuah Shlema and continued better and better, and we should all have good health.
Amen.
Thank you, Rabbi. I do have a question.
Yeah.
We were talking about the Torah prohibition of using the Nile, which is why Yocheved placed the. Henry says hi to Joey.
Hi, Henry.
Which is why she placed the basket in the mash. But how did she know that if the Torah wasn't given to us yet?
So there were. Well, first of all, I already explained. First of all, there were many things that they didn't know. A lot of the Torah, the laws of the Torah. You remember we spoke about this before. It says Avram sat and studied in yeshiva. Yitzchak studied in yeshiva. Yaakov studied in yeshiva. I don't know if you remember, we spoke about this one time. And the laws of the Torah, the forefathers were prophets. They were given over, and then they studied them. The laws of the Torah before it was given, they were. Actually, it says it's an open verse in the Torah. If you look back by Abraham, God said He's beloved to me because He keeps mitzvosai, torosai, chukosai, shmarti, which means my commandments, my Torah, my what Torah? What are we talking about? So we know that the oral Torah tells us that they actually study mitzvot. Now there are a lot of things they didn't really know because they didn't know the stories of the Torah because they were the story. The commandments and laws and stuff like that they did. And it did. So obviously they had faith in Hashem. Where did they get that from? They knew that they're a special people. They knew that they're godly people. They knew what's in the future is going to happen. But the Torah wasn't giving them. And they kept things as sort of as we're going to do it traditionally, not as a commandment.
Thank you. I was familiar with the patriarchs, but so it extended all the way through.
It extended down.
Moses.
It says the tribe of Levi were the teachers. If you'll notice in the Egyptian slavery, Moses and Aaron keep on going to Pharaoh and going back. Why weren't they enslaved? The tribe of Levi were the ministers. And Pharaoh said every country has religious leaders. They'll be the religious leaders. So they weren't enslaved in the same way. They had a certain level of freedom, not that they weren't free. So they were the ones that transmitted the Torah. And Amram, Moshe's father, was from the tribe of Levi, as Moshe of course was. And he was the leader of the tribe of Levi. So that's what it happened. That was the history of that. Anything else? Any other questions, guys?
Yeah, this is heavy stuff, Rabbi.
Yeah.
This is dense.
Dense. Yeah.
If I wanted to hear of a lesson again, is it available online?
Yes, it is. It's on Facebook. I think it is. I put it on Facebook before, so it should be on.
Okay,
Yes.
great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And thanks for your teaching, Rabbi.
You're welcome. Pleasure.
Thank you, Rabbi.
All right, everybody. Good night. Guys, please go online and try to get people to contribute to the end of year campaign. That's my pitch. I got to give a pitch at the end. Okay? And double the impact. Let's raise that 75 grand before the end of the year. All the best, everybody.
Thank you,
Okay.
Rabbi Yashikoa.
Rabbi. Yes. Yes. You still there? Oh, she said thank you. Okay, great.
Okay.
Right.
Okay, goodbye.
Right.